dust is slowly beginning to settle on what seems to have been this all-out social media war about The Last of Us Part 2. Opinions range heavily, strong emotions are involved, and that is not so surprising given the nature of this story. When the original Last of Us released, it was a widely beloved game that I think many people connected with on a very personal level. It's honestly a testament to how immersive and believable these crafted experiences can be nowadays, and Naughty Dog's games are prime examples when it comes to this. When there are characters you relate to this deeply, what often happens is that people grow a certain sense of ownership over this story. In their own eyes, it becomes their favorite game, their cherished characters, and that's where conflicts can develop between those fans and the interests of its actual creators. For the last 2 years, I've become extremely aware of this phenomenon, and I've been thinking a lot about the limits of creative freedom, whether there are any or whether there should be. Almost like a reflex reaction, my inclination would be to tell myself I shouldn't be able to dictate what direction a creator wishes to take the narrative of its sequel into. Nevertheless, I personally can't say I judge people who, as a fan, feel the sense of ownership either, because the truth is, I felt it myself in a few instances as well. One of those occasions always happened to be with Naughty Dog. I fell in love with the Uncharted series. I've covered the games on my channel for close to a decade now, and I've grown so used to being excited about whatever they had in store. The last thing I would have wanted was to confess to myself I wasn't really counting down the days to the next game anymore, for the simple reason that I couldn't have possibly pictured myself ever saying that in the past. The reality, however, was that despite greatly enjoying the first The Last of Us, it was never as near and dear to me as it was to others. I also grew a little bit worried about Naughty Dog over time, after a streak of small yet slightly off-putting choices of focus that had me questioning their intentions moving forward. While they are obviously fully in their right to do as they see fit, I just noticed my own interest slipping away as a consequence. I think disconnecting myself from that inner attachment really helped me not to let my gut instincts do the thinking for me, at least most of the time. I livestreamed my first experience playing through The Last of Us Part 2, and I definitely enjoyed myself for a good 3/4 of the game, even though, admittedly, I had a much harder time accepting some of its final moments as I watched the credits roll. Fortunately, a second playthrough, this time solely on my own, really helped me come to terms with what it is this game ultimately tried to offer. It may not have been the story that I had wanted, and there are several flaws and inconsistencies to point out, but I do think I have a much better understanding now of what it is that Naughty Dog set out to deliver. Contrary to myself though, many others did not see these things coming. For them, the turn this franchise took happened abruptly, and the situation playing out right in front of us now is the result. There is blame for this on several sides, and instead of focusing merely on the game itself, I think that overall there is a much larger, a more fascinating conversation to be had here. It's just as interesting to speculate about the intentions and the choices behind it all, as far as the thought processes that led to this storyline, the way it was marketed to us, what this means for the future of Naughty Dog, and therefore, trust me, we'll get into all of that as the video goes on. That being said, the reality is that indeed this is clearly a divisive game. Some people loved what they received, others were okay with it, and some would truly call it a disgrace. But you know what? All of those are valid outlooks, as long as you back them up with valid arguments. Sadly though, toxicity is at an all-time high with this game, and among hordes of both haters as well as fanboys who I've seen desperate to either protect or destroy this game they feel so strongly about, lots of fake narratives are also being made up as long as they support their own view. It is a most unfortunate situation, on top of which I've seen even a few developers and the games media who have decided to take part. Like I said, there is a lot to dissect here. I want to stay balanced and fairly highlight both sides of the coin, while of course also giving you all my own honest in-depth thoughts. One thing is for certain, I think The Last of Us Part 2 will be remembered as much as the original was. Whether that will be for the same reasons, we'll have to find out. I briefly mentioned it in the intro, but when the original The Last of Us hit the PlayStation 3 back in 2013, the impact it made on the gaming community cannot be understated. Many people connected to this story on a personal level, I think mostly because it conveyed the emotions of its main characters in such a relatable manner. You felt for Joel, a visibly broken man, after the game's opening as you witnessed the moment in which he loses his daughter. 20 years on, Joel had become understandably hardened in this now developed post-apocalyptic world, relentlessly murdering those who stood in his way without giving it any thought, all in the pursuit of survival alone. That all changes when Ellie shows up. Over the course of a long journey across the country, delivering her to the Fireflies because of her immunity, The Last of Us managed to successfully let us watch how the relationship between these two characters grows. Ellie starts off as a companion Joel is reluctantly forced to smuggle out of the city, but ends up filling that void he had always felt as a new surrogate daughter. Joel ultimately makes it his life goal to protect her. There is one problem. At the end of the game, he gets put in that position where he has to make an immoral choice. He fights his way through a hospital full of Fireflies, preventing the possibility of finding a cure just to save Ellie from her unavoidable death. The arc had come to its natural conclusion, but ends on a bleak yet thought-provoking note. Ellie will have to live with the fact that Joel lied to her, even though she's very much aware he did. Looking back at where Part 1 ended, there were several directions Naughty Dog could have gone into with a sequel. While many people had voiced their opinion that they didn't feel this game ever needed one, I'm sure following up the story after this massive success was a no-brainer for financial reasons alone. The question then becomes, what should the sequel be about? Should it continue Joel and Ellie's timeline, focused on figuring out a way to resolve the unease that would now undoubtedly be present between the two, or should it aim for something else entirely? After all, this is a vast universe with lots of opportunities to highlight totally different factions and the people within them, all surely with their own stories to tell as well.
No matter what, you keep finding something to fight for. Now, I know that's not what you want to hear right now.
Swear to me. Swear to me that everything that you've said about the Fireflies is true.
I swear.
Okay.
Well, I imagine the quote-unquote safe sequel wasn't something Naughty Dog and its creative director Neil Druckmann seemed particularly interested to explore. Especially taking in mind what had transpired in the 7 years leading up to this game, it's really not hard to understand why. Neil Druckmann is an incredibly talented writer, which I've always been the first person to say. Since joining the studio as an intern during the development of Jak 3, he has managed to work his way up all the way to now being the vice president of the company and creatively responsible for some of Naughty Dog's most critically acclaimed games. Now, Neil has always been known to be a bit more interested in pushing certain boundaries than his co-workers would. Committed followers of Naughty Dog will remember stories all the way back to the development of Uncharted 2, where it was Neil who had vouched for Elena to die at the end of the game. Ultimately, it would be the heads above him, Bruce Straley and Amy Hennig, who shot off that idea. Ever since his rising to the top, Neil has been able to put his own stamp on the games the company has developed. As a creative director, The Last of Us was basically his baby, and the company also took an outspokenly more activist approach, pushing social messages that he and those who surround him believe are important to promote. I've already extensively touched on all of this in some of my videos in the past. When Uncharted 4 released in 2016, I believe it may have marked a critical moment, a point of no return for the company's ambitions. For about a decade now, Naughty Dog had created masterpiece after masterpiece, won Game of the Year after Game of the Year, and every time for their incredible execution of what was the so-called safe story. Uncharted 4 had actually been forced onto Neil, after Amy Hennig left Naughty Dog over conflicts regarding how the game was coming along. The responsibility wasn't just imposed on him now to rewrite the story for an Uncharted game he was never even interested in doing any longer, but the last Uncharted game that would seal off Nathan Drake's adventures. Neil did something here that in hindsight I deeply respect about him. Rumors began to circulate, fans had started to worry that Uncharted 4 would become too dark. Its reveal trailer had been purposefully bleak. Expectations were shaped through many interviews with him that characters were gonna die, and that this series may end on a fundamentally different note. Behind the scenes, however, Neil Druckmann might have had those desires, but he never intended on putting them into practice. He knew that this was Amy Hennig's series at the end of the day and had to do it justice by writing a most fitting finale that, in my opinion, hit all the right notes. Uncharted 4 brought Nathan Drake's story full circle, through an emotional journey that felt distinctive yet honored the series' legacy and paid tribute to its characters. Reliving past memories by looking at old artifacts in Drake's attic, meaningful character confrontations that paid off years of history, and that look on Elena's face, realizing Drake was made for this life after finding all the pirate captains poisoned at the table. This was a game written by Neil Druckmann, but I'll be the very first to say he fundamentally understood Amy Hennig's core vision and chose to respectfully finish the story in the best way he could. With Naughty Dog's reputation once more solidified, another masterpiece out the door, and Neil Druckmann finally released from his obligation and now able to return to the world of The Last of Us, the IP he had personally built and had full ownership over, where could they possibly go next? Now was the time to finally break with tradition, to exceed the limits and subvert all expectations. Many fans may have wanted a typical sequel with Joel and Ellie, but the time finally seemed ripe for those interests to clash. And thus, I think Neil Druckmann and Naughty Dog wrote the story they wanted to tell. However, that story would require some great sacrifices to be made.
Okay?
You're gonna fucking die!
What's going on?
Let him go.
Who is that?
Let him
She
go!
snuck in.
Why aren't you posted up outside?
We didn't think anyone was gonna show up.
What the hell did you expect? We gotta get out of here before the whole town's on top of us. You're done.
You want what I want, right?
End it. Now.
Joel, get up. Joel, fucking get up. Please stop. Please don't shoot. Joel, please get up. No!
The Last of Us Part 2 practically kicks off with the death of Joel. Merely 2 hours into the game, in what is basically his second appearance, Joel is viciously murdered by the character of Abby, who is then established as someone we can only feel utter contempt for from now on. This piece of knowledge alone has caused a lot of backlash, of which the majority already started a few months ago. PlayStation unexpectedly faced an enormous problem leading up to launch. Major plot points, cutscenes, and the complete story structure of The Last of Us Part 2 had leaked, including this exact moment, and ever since it's been chaos. Even now, weeks after launch, the public opinion doesn't appear to have really changed, no matter how desperately we were told to wait for all the required context first. That's not so surprising. For many vocal fans, Joel was at the heart of the original game. He was a huge reason for the appeal that it had, and killing him off so early comes as a massive gut punch. Obviously, it not only drastically changes the story direction from the one this game could have taken, it may appear like a middle finger to some fans. But Joel's death would only go on to be the first of many bold decisions that were made for this game. Like how you only play as Ellie for half of the campaign, how the other half puts you in the shoes of Abby, the same character responsible for Joel's demise. On one hand, I can actually commend Neil Druckmann and the team for doing something drastically different this time around. That undoubtedly takes balls to do. That being said, it is clear that consumers weren't just led to purchase this game woefully unprepared, they were repeatedly being lied to. Looking back at the announcement trailer of The Last of Us Part 2 back in 2016, it's actually pretty easy to see that it does accurately portray what Ellie's side of the game ended up being. Joel comes into the picture as an almost ghost-like figure, indicating that he indeed died, while Ellie appears hell-bent on revenge, saying she will find and kill every last one of them. At the time, this was already a fairly popular theory for what the trailer truly meant, but those claims were always dismissed by Naughty Dog itself. During panels at PSX, Neil Druckmann would constantly reassure fans that Joel and Ellie were still very much at the heart of this game, that it revolved around both of them, and that it was even called Part 2 to double down on exactly that. While Joel's absence from many of the trailers that followed was suspicious to say the least, the mentioning of him at the E3 2018 trailer and then his reappearance in the release date trailer solidified for most of us that there was little to worry about anymore. But that was a big lie. It turns out that the recent trailer in which Joel catches up to Ellie at the end was Naughty Dog's most deceptive trailer yet. In the past, the company would already hide certain characters from trailer scenes or cut up the footage in a way that it would imply certain events, but going this far they had never done before. The impression was purposefully manufactured that Joel would help Ellie on this quest and that it was likely Dina they were avenging in the game. Dina was hidden from some scenes she ends up being present in. The snowstorm in which you lose her was cleverly tied to the moment where Ellie walks down the stairs into a room where someone is killed. Meanwhile, Joel's character model was literally used to replace that of Jesse, going so far as to have Troy Baker record a voice line that would never make sense within the story of the game. Now, I don't think that the act of misleading people with a trailer is necessarily a problematic thing. I totally understand that there are plot details you don't want to give away, that you don't want fans to be able to piece it all together in advance. The fact that Abby's half of the campaign was hidden is a choice I can actually respect. After all, not saying anything is always better than lying on purpose. These are surprises you simply want to preserve, and that's okay. However, why you wouldn't be upfront about Joel's death honestly goes beyond me. Not only could you have avoided the majority of all the outcry, it would have shaped much more fair expectations in terms of what this game definitely wasn't going to be. All the surprises later on would have still been kept intact, and so much of the late controversy would have never happened. Comparisons to Metal Gear Solid 2 have repeatedly been made. In Metal Gear Solid 2, players were only shown parts of the prologue featuring Solid Snake prior to launch, when a completely new character, Raiden, would be a protagonist for the rest of the campaign. However, a few small but key details differentiate the two subjects from each other. Solid Snake's trailer scenes were accurate and in the game. Solid Snake never died, in fact Solid Snake still played a huge role as your companion at the Big Shell. His part may not have been what you had expected, but his share within the story was just as large. Instead, Naughty Dog made promises and didn't live up to them at all. They replaced Joel's character model in every single flashback scene, making it appear like he had joined Ellie, and the game still very much revolved around the two of them. In reality, his death is literally the catalyst that kickstarts this new journey, and Joel's total contribution to this game amounted to about an hour and a half, if not less. Me personally, what doesn't sit well with me is the suspicion that taking this approach was just a dirty tactic to get more people to buy the game, relying on their nostalgic feelings, their love for Joel and Part 1's themes, in order to maximize sales and profits. Naughty Dog wanted to make the game they wanted to make, but they were very much afraid that it wasn't the game most people would have wanted to see, and thus they chose to lie. I know they'll never admit to it, but if it's true, that's just something I cannot be on board with. The Last of Us Part 2's narrative would end up becoming a different beast entirely, which brings me to my observations and opinions on the story that we did get. What really struck me while playing through the game is how much it comes across as a commentary on a few common criticisms and remarks Naughty Dog had always faced in the past. After the hospital massacre at the end of Part 1, some people deemed it a turning point where Joel became the bad guy of this story. They viewed it as an act of pure selfishness, murdering dozens of Firefly members in order to save a person from impending death who Joel had now become deeply attached to. You can, however, raise question marks whether that interpretation is the correct one. There was never any guarantee that a cure was going to be found, nor was Ellie ever given a fair opportunity to give the go-ahead herself. Another often heard critique had to do with what is called ludonarrative dissonance. In the Uncharted series, there would always be a noticeable disparity between the way Nathan Drake could on one hand kill thousands of enemy soldiers, but somehow do it with a smile on his face, all the while making jokes around his best friends. In the case of both Nathan Drake as well as Joel, there were never any real repercussions for their in-game actions. It's like Naughty Dog looked at these remarks and decided to build the entire story of this game around them. On a surface level, my impression is that it wants to show us that there is no black and white, that in the world of The Last of Us, no heroes or villains truly exist. Every faction and every person, whether they may be your ally or whether they may want to kill you at first sight, is simply doing what they can in order to survive. It tries to tell you that Abby isn't by definition a bad person. She may have had just as much of a right to her own revenge, hell, maybe even more than Ellie does right now. Abby's father was one of the victims of Joel's deeds, and for that she had been preparing for years to make him pay. However, before revealing this to you as a player, Naughty Dog attempts to trigger your natural instincts, so you will root for Ellie on this quest. To you, some unknown person just murdered Joel, your beloved character, and thus you can't help but want the same payback as Ellie does. As you then learn more and more about Abby's character towards the second half, slowly but surely the realization kicks in that she may be every bit as justified in her motives too, bringing along a great inner conflict with yourself. For the very first time, this game presents actual consequences to some of the actions of a previous game, and I know, it sounds like a cool idea on paper, right? There is but one issue for me: when you start going down this road, the potential amount of inconsistencies you'll create are limitless, and so the more I thought about it, it's honestly an utterly silly concept to try and sell. First and foremost, I think the big mistake Naughty Dog makes here is even taking these critiques about the disconnect between story and gameplay seriously, because they're honestly unreasonable. Video games have for eternity required us to suspend our disbelief somewhat, and it would be impossible not to. Our protagonists manage to overcome literally impossible odds because they are meant to do so. We kill thousands of zombies without getting bit, we fall out of planes and survive, take out an army of soldiers on our own, and we slay enormous dragons 500 times our own size. In the real world, playing by our own rules, none of these things would make any sense, but we accept it for what it is, because if not, what game do we have left? If taking a bullet during gameplay had the same effect as taking one in a cutscene, trust me, you might as well not boot it up at all. If every enemy we defeat brings the potential of having their family members hunt us down, I'll give you 5 minutes before the entire country is on your tail. And don't get it twisted, The Last of Us is no exception in this regard. In the first entry, we murdered hundreds of hunters, we evaporated David's gang, escaped dozens of clickers, bloaters, and successfully traveled across the entirety of an America riddled with infected in the span of a year. But somehow, I am now supposed to accept that it's the one doctor, just another casualty you've likely forgotten about 10 seconds after stabbing him in the neck, who ends up being used to show us that this is a world with consequences and changes the very course of the franchise? Please give me a break. The problem is that there was never any weight to his death whatsoever, already proven by the fact most of us did it in a heartbeat, not to forget how we eagerly shot the 2 assistants next to him as well. In the end, they were just 3 more obstacles standing in our way of saving Ellie, like the massive amount of NPCs who came before them. Just like any game that preceded it, the journey of The Last of Us would be unrealistic by real-world standards, and you know what? That is totally fine. The reason we are able to take the less convincing side of our books, movies, and games for granted is because those sides almost always serve as a backdrop for what the story is truly about. Nobody loved the first game because it made them think about the impact their actions should have had, not just on one doctor's daughter, but literally thousands of remaining survivors. They did it because it limited its range of focus, and within that range, told a relatable story between 2 characters, which it pulled off very well. Alas, it is definitely hard to look back positively at a story when you disagree with the very fundamentals behind its intentions. Fortunately, the well-acted characters and their motives within this scope are obviously not as hard to appreciate and follow along with. Now, before I get lost in the heat of the moment, you'd almost forget we're talking about a video game here after all, for which gameplay itself is obviously not an unimportant part. To me, it was by far the most enjoyable aspect of The Last of Us Part 2, and my position towards Naughty Dog in this regard remains unchanged. As a pure AAA production, this game once more showcases everything about this developer I've been advocating for years now. That they have nailed it in terms of responsiveness of their controls, and that their combat stands out over just about any other game in the genre. While mostly just a refined version over its predecessor, it applies a couple of innovative features that were already introduced in Uncharted 4. Much wider environments, boat riding, and an open world section. The enhanced agility also came as a welcome change. You can jump, crouch, as well as squeeze yourself through spaces in tight combat situations, and there are a few added gadgets like the very useful pistol silencers. When all hell does break loose, the gunplay is as satisfying as ever, even though the tweaks to aim acceleration made me feel slightly less in control this time around. I do think that's a purposeful choice, increasing the tension of encounters overall. Old classic weapons like the bow and bolt action rifle make a return, while Abby's hunting pistol has quickly become one of my, if not favorite weapons across both games in the series. I recently made a video focused on Naughty Dog's level design, much of which was once more iterated on here. The blood trails or yellow cables on the ground to guide your way, the moments of being deceptively led to a dead end and having your companions call out the solution as you turn around. By now, I really should have been aware when I was being tricked, but somehow they had me shake my head in disbelief again every single time. Furthermore, there is added verticality, including a couple of environmental puzzles where you throw ropes in order to swing across gaps, and there's an open world level akin to Uncharted 4 and The Lost Legacy. Initially, I was a little afraid they'd overutilize these levels to extend the playtime, but fortunately you only run into one of these areas once and it doesn't overstay its welcome. Oddly enough, inconsistent pacing is however the biggest downside when it comes to the gameplay. There are several relatively drawn out gameplay sequences to the extent where I'd either forget my actual objective or the story just began to drag. For most of this, the wider game design isn't really to blame, although there can be loot around every corner, and the desire not to miss out on useful materials also stretches these levels out significantly. Ellie's adventure, which makes up the first half of the game, can be described as pretty straightforward. It's a trailing mission to take revenge on the people who deeply hurt her, which makes it easy to relate to at first. Having said that, as you progress and see Ellie crossing off photos of each member, as she becomes willing to increase her sacrifices just to be able to move on to the next one, the more her fixation on that single objective just didn't feel right with me anymore, which I think was Naughty Dog's goal. In the end, it would be Ellie's companions who I therefore surprisingly warmed up to. Dina had given off the completely wrong impressions to me during the E3 2018 demo, fearing that her personality was gonna be explosive and overly present. The opposite turned out to be the case. She plays much more of a supportive role, and that's no wonder considering the traumatic event Ellie just had to endure. Dina's tenderness therefore left me much more sympathetic to her character than I expected before. My biggest gripe, however, would be that she never undergoes any real development as a character either. She stays in that same role throughout until you discover that the only ever purpose for her to be there is so she can leave by the very end, to emphasize how much Ellie's obsession with revenge has ultimately cost her. Tommy and Jesse also shined each moment they appeared, albeit that our encounters with them are sadly limited. The way we split up with companions numerous times also felt a little inorganic to say the least, failing to mask that the developer is obviously trying to find an excuse to give Ellie some time alone. The depressing thought for me, and I don't want to constantly fall back to it, but it's how Ellie's flashbacks ultimately reveal a potential for this game that the main product itself could never live up to. The few instances where Joel and Ellie shared the screen is where the game truly peaked. Fortunately, how it later resolves this needlessly small arc after their inevitable breaking moment was executed with sheer perfection in my eyes. While Ellie's journey remains relatively consistent in how engaging it is, Abby's side of the campaign contains a lot of both highs and lows, on one hand flooding you with the less interesting flashbacks as well as drawn out combat segments, but also featuring the most variety, set pieces and engaging story beats if you'd ask me. The latter, I think, is very much a purposeful decision to try and make us associate our positive feelings with Abby as a character. Her gameplay sequences are a lot of fun, whether it's going on a patrol with the WLF, crawling across the enormous sky bridge while seeing her visibly in fear of the heights, or battling the enormous Rat King boss in what is pretty much a Resident Evil-esque horror sequence at the bottom floor of the hospital. Story-wise, we pick up a few months after Abby has finally taken her long-desired revenge on the man who killed her father. In the wake of this event, however, she comes to the realization that her nightmares still haven't gone away, and thus tries to find redemption elsewhere by helping out the two kids she meets, Lev and Yara. Abby's activities are in complete contrast to those of Ellie, which I will say is often mirrored to you as a player in overly transparent ways. Ellie stabs dogs, Abby pets dogs. Ellie knows no mercy, Abby does. Ellie kills a pregnant woman, Abby saves a pregnant woman. It's pretty surface level stuff. What I do find interesting to see is how many people continue to react so negatively to a character nonetheless. Funnily enough, the main question I've seen people ask is whether they were supposed to root for Abby, to which I would say it doesn't really matter because it's not the goal. All this game is trying to do is make you understand her actions and her position, in which I think it absolutely does succeed. As I try to explain, for me it's not really execution as much as it is the core premise that I simply find unjustified to base the game around. In the end, I don't hate Abby, I don't really love her as a character either, she's there, her arc makes sense, I just feel rather indifferent towards it. At the end of the day, I truly think The Last of Us Part 2 will come to signify a new era Naughty Dog is stepping into. Gone are the days of old, now will mark the time of a new, emboldened Naughty Dog, exploring unknown territory when it comes to storytelling and relentless in pushing the ideals it prioritizes. For some, this will be seen as a positive, and others will certainly view it as more of a pity. Admittedly, I rolled my eyes a couple of times at the bigot sandwiches, the transgender subplot, and the extremely dramatic choice for Abby's physique. They weren't deal breakers, they didn't ruin the game, but they're definitely proof of a Naughty Dog that has become immensely driven in promoting other messages that, regardless of whether people agree or disagree, not everybody is going to care for. Right now, endless back and forth is taking place over the implementation of particular story moments. Do they make sense? Are they believable within this world? For example, would Joel have so recklessly stepped into the room with a bunch of strangers and given away his name, considering his level of caution in the past? People are making cases for either side, and there is absolutely something to be said for both. Partly, that's the reality of a brutal post-apocalyptic universe, right? Death comes at you swiftly indeed. However, for me, it isn't these events nor their execution that necessarily intrigues me. At the end of the day, Naughty Dog's intentions drive these story decisions, and the simple fact is that they made a conscious decision that Joel would get to play a minor role in this story so they could attempt to explore new characters and storylines. They made a conscious decision to feature a new protagonist with Abby, to portray the events of the first game in a more negative light, and to show that in The Last of Us, no character is truly good or evil. Meanwhile, all the context people are fighting over was simply made up later on. In pursuit of their desire to push for progressive ideals, whether in the characters they introduced or the more interpretable approach of this new storyline, a conscious sacrifice was also made by abandoning any potential a different sequel could have had. You can be heavily against or very open towards those intentions, but in my eyes, it is quite obviously the thought process behind what we received. The Last of Us Part 2 is not a traditionally satisfying game experience as much as it is an evocative work of art. It's not an objectively amazing nor a terrible work of art, but it just left me constantly asking what and why. sometimes out of disappointment, sometimes out of plain curiosity. Why was this decision made? What was the point of all of this? Why did this character have to die and this one stay alive? It's hard to pinpoint exactly how I feel about this game, and that may have very well been its exact goal. If so, it has actually accomplished what it set out to do, but I'll continue to ask myself whether that is true. Unquestionably, there are few games that can make me feel this range of emotions. Disappointment, disbelief, but sometimes also sheer amazement or affection. In one of the game's final moments, where it's revealed that Ellie decided to give Joel a second chance just one day before his death, the thought of it alone as he's playing that song on his guitar, it's just bittersweet. Acceptance forms the driving theme for me throughout this game. We can see that in its ending, how Ellie comes to terms with the fact that revenge will never turn back the clock and therefore breaks the cycle. It's about accepting the faith of the characters you love, accepting that this is the game you ultimately got and that this is where the studio may very well be heading. That's a difficult thing, but I think I've managed and I'm able to move on. The truth is, I don't really have an opinion on this game. I don't hate it, I don't love it. I felt kind of indifferent at first, but then a second playthrough got me to understand some decisions a little more. As a content creator, you are always asked, and therefore you always want to have an opinion on something. But because this is a game where I think the intentions matter more than the actual decisions, and I can't confirm whether my suspicions are even true, it is impossible to say anything for certain.